Hey everybody, good morning. It's such a great pleasure to introduce Irwin Cotler. The Honorable Irwin Cotler is Canada's Special Envoy on preserving Holocaust remembrance and combating anti-Semitism. He's the International Chair of the Raoul Wallenberg Center for Human Rights. He's an Emeritus Professor of Law at McGill University. He's the former Minister of Justice and Attorney General of Canada, longtime member of the Canadian Parliament, and a member of the high-level panel of legal experts on media freedom. And there's more information about Irwin's distinguished career in the program bio, but let me just say that he is the author of many, many publications that we've used at AAN and cited frequently, seminal legal articles that he's written on landmark charter rights cases in the areas of free speech, freedom of religion, rights for minorities, peace law, war crimes, justice. And Irwin, we are so honored that you have recently agreed to join AAN's advisory board. We're just delighted. And also, as I've been telling our colleagues here at our conference, we are really looking forward to the potential expansion of AAN into Canada in the coming year. And to bringing our resources and programming to faculty in Canada and connecting those faculty with our network, now nearly 850 faculty across all ranks and disciplines on some 260 campuses across the United States, and hopefully many more soon in Canada. So please join me in welcoming the Honorable Irwin Cotler.
Thank you, Miriam, for those very kind words of introduction. I must say that I wish I would be able to be with you in person. It's just that commitments here in Ottawa, to which I just recently arrived from Israel, have prevented me from doing so. And I look forward to see any of the recordings and to continue to participate in your work. I also equally look forward to the initiation of an important Canadian component of the AEN, because your framing of the issues in terms of engaging and educating and empowering faculty, students, the university culture is exactly what is needed in Canada. And your example in the States is an inspiration for all of us. Recently, while in Israel, I participated in the first ever meeting of special envoys to combat anti-Semitism, which took place on the eve of Yom HaShoah V'Hagvura, National Holocaust Remembrance Day. As we were about to convene, reports emerged, for example, from the League for Human Rights of B'nai B'rith Canada, of an alarming escalation in anti-Semitism, the highest escalation in the last 40 years that such reports have been drawn up. And similar reports were shared from the United States in terms of the ADL recent report, France, the UK, Australia, which reported a 35% increase in the last year. And it wasn't only a rise in anti-Semitic incidents, it was a rise also in violent anti-Semitic incidences, in exponential rise on hate speech, anti-Semitic hate speech on the internet. And in all the reports, the Israel-Hamas war of May 2021, a year ago, was a tipping point and a dramatic rise with respect to anti-Semitism globally, and also reflecting the intersection of events as they happen in the Middle East and as they reverberate back in the United States and elsewhere. In other words, the globalization of anti-Semitism. And this led to a discussion which shared the following paradox. Number one, there was this dramatic escalation of anti-Semitism globally. At the same time, as it was mentioned, there were more forces combating anti-Semitism than ever before. Our gathering for the first time ever of special envoys in Jerusalem was one case study of those forces. There was a time when there were no special envoys at all, let alone them convening in Jerusalem. There were at the same time national action plans to combat anti-Semitism. And I can go on. So the question was, how do we explain this paradox? And it warrants, I think, an understanding of the origins, nature, and impact of anti-Semitism, of the various tipping points, and I mentioned one of them, and also an appreciation of how do we respond to this paradox, this seeming paradox, and what recommendations can be made for action to be taken. I think it's important to begin with, if we're discussing about the nature and essence and impact of anti-Semitism, important to begin with the understanding that anti-Semitism is not only, as we know, the oldest, longest, most enduring and lethal form of hate, but one which mutates and metastasizes over time. But it's always anchored in one historical, generic, conspiratorial trope, and that is the Jews as the enemy of all that is good and the embodiment of all that is evil, reflected in whatever is the zeitgeist at any particular moment. So when the zeitgeist was Christianity, then the Jews were held to be guilty of deicide. When the zeitgeist became, at that time, the Black Plague in the Middle Ages, so the Jews were the poisoners of the wells. And when the zeitgeist became, and now I turn to not only the 20th century, but in the 1970s, when the zeitgeist became the explosion in human rights, when human rights emerged as the new secular religion of our times, as I wrote about it at the time. But U.S. Congressman Robert Drinan, Father Robert Drinan, wrote a book at that point in the mid-70s on the history and hopes of the human rights revolution, where he said that the elevation of human rights into an international juridical norm was the most dramatic development in contemporary jurisprudence. But what was happening at the same time, and what was going largely unacknowledged, as well as unaddressed, let alone redressed, was the emergence of Israel at this point as the meta human rights violator, as the enemy of all that was good and the embodiment of all that was evil. In other words, of Israel as the new Antichrist of our time. Let me give you an excerpt from 1974, a snapshot of 1974. And this snapshot has continued annually ever since, of the manner in which, if you will, anti-Semitism was being laundered under the cover of human rights, or even under the cover of the protective cover of the United Nations, authority of international law, culture of human rights, struggle against racism, and the like. And so it was then in 1974, a year before the UN General Assembly resolution of Zionism as racism, that Israel was held out to be the enemy of labor. Evidence, the resolution of the International Labor Organization at the time condemning Israeli suppression of Palestinian trade unionism. I can use the word alleged, but these resolutions were adopted as I'm sharing them with you. The enemy of health. Evidence, the resolution of the World Health Organization condemning then Israeli poisonings of Palestinians in the West Bank. I might add that in the last 2 years, Israel was held out to be the only violator of health rights in the world, the enemy of culture, evidence the resolution of UNESCO condemning Israeli desecration of Palestinian holy sites in Jerusalem and in the West Bank, the enemy of women, evidence the resolution of the UN Commission on the Status of Women, condemning Israel for its suppression of Palestinian women's rights. May I add that yet again in 2020, Israel was held out to be the only violator of women's rights in the world, as it was being held out as the only violator of health rights in the world. The enemy of peace, evidence the resolution of the UN General Assembly, condemning Israel as a non-peace loving nation. And finally, the enemy of human rights, the resolution of the UN Commission on Human Rights, at the time the predecessor of the UN Council on Human Rights, condemning Israeli suppression of human rights. And so it was that Israel, as the enemy of labor, health, culture, women, peace, and human rights, Israel held out to be the enemy of all that is good and the embodiment of all that is evil. And this, in effect, was the first tipping point in what I speak of in terms of anti-Semitism and the weaponization of human rights, as I've described it, and under which anti-Semitism is laundered. This process of the laundering of anti-Semitism under the cover of human rights has effectively continued over the last 52 years, sometimes imperceptibly, indulgently, but inexorably. And this brings me now to a second tipping point. A second tipping point being the World Conference Against Racism held in Durban, South Africa in September 2001. I must say that when it was first announced that there was going to be an anti-racism conference in Durban, South Africa, and it was so announced in the late 1997, 1998, I greeted this with not only anticipation, but excitement. This was going to be the first human rights conference of the 21st century in which anti-racism was going to be the organizing theme. Indeed, it was going to be the first international human rights legal conference of the 21st century, and was going to be held in Durban, South Africa, the birthplace of South African apartheid. And as someone who had been involved in the anti-apartheid movement for years, in fact, I was arrested in South Africa in 1981 when giving a talk there. Title of the talk, If Sharansky, Why Not Mandela, which led me also to be involved in Mandela's case and cause thereafter. But you can appreciate this sense of anticipation, as I said, if not excitement, that I had. But what happened at Durban, to use an oft-abused metaphor, was truly Orwellian. A world conference against racism and hate turned into a conference of racism and hate against Israel and the Jewish people. A world conference on human rights singled out one state, Israel, one people, the Jewish people, for selective opprobrium and indictment. A world conference that was to call or to commemorate the dismantling of South Africa as an apartheid state became a conference calling for the dismantling of Israel as an apartheid state. Indeed, as I am speaking with you today, I can still see the marches, the thousands of students and others marching. I can still hear the chants that kept repeating themselves, that the struggle against racism in the 20th century required the dismantling of South Africa as an apartheid state, and the struggle against racism in the 21st century requires the dismantling of Israel as an apartheid state. I can still see the placards, I can still see the posters, not only about Israel and apartheid, but Israel as a Nazi state. I can still see the stereotypical posters and placards of Jews with hooked noses and fangs dripping in blood. I can still see the images of a group of Jewish students being assaulted right outside of the NGO forum, saying, "You don't belong to the human race." There were three conferences at Durban, or forums at the same time. There was the Intergovernmental Conference, and I was there in Durban as a member of the Canadian delegation to the Durban Conference. There was the NGO forum, and there was the student forum. And I participated in all three, and I'm sharing with you briefly penetrating pictures of the kind of delegitimization and demonization that was going on. Those of us who were there at Durban were, I have to say, forever transformed. Durban was indelibly implanted not only on our memory, but on our being. I flew back from Durban to Montreal on September 10th. Like all of us, I awoke in the morning of September 11th to 9/11. I was called later that day by one of my colleagues from South Africa who had been at the Durban conference, who said to me something that I never forgot. She said that if 9/11 was the Kristallnacht of terror, then Durban was the Mein Kampf. And indeed, Durban became the framing for the weaponization of human rights to combat anti-Semitism, this being the second tipping point. The first being, as I said, the emergence of human rights as the new secular religion of our time, and Israel held out to be the meta human rights violator of our time, something which began in the 70s, continued inexorably till Durban, and then Durban became a second tipping point. And what happened in the immediate aftermath of Durban was the launching in the 21st century of the assault within the framework of human rights and the weaponization of human rights of what might be called a new anti-Semitism. By that I mean that traditional anti-Semitism was the discrimination against, denial of, assault upon the rights of Jews to live as equal members in whatever society they inhabit. The new anti-Semitism, which began with the human rights revolution in the 70s, which Durban became the second tipping point, was a discrimination against, denial of, assault upon the right of Israel and the Jewish people to live as an equal member of the family of nations. What is common to both forms of anti-Semitism, old and new, is discrimination. All that has happened is that it has passed from discrimination against the Jews as individuals to the discrimination against the Jews as a people, and then reverberating back against the Jews as individuals and as a community wherever they reside. Let me just share with you what occurred in the immediate aftermath of Durban. Jews were blamed for 9/11. And this is a process that also has found expression over time. The UN General Assembly met, and in its annual condemnation of Israel, condemned Israel in some 20 resolutions of condemnation, and only 5 resolutions against the rest of the world combined. The UN Commission on Human Rights met, and in a disproportionate set of resolutions, again, singled out Israel for selective opprobrium and indictment. At the University of Michigan, the launching of the BDS movement began in the immediate aftermath of Durban. And here it's interesting as to what occurred at the time. And as academics, we might appreciate this particular dynamic. A resolution that was proposed at that time for the support of a two-state solution if Israel were to become a democratic state, itself problematic, was defeated and replaced by a resolution condemning Israel and calling for its dismantling as an apartheid state, and that helped launch the BDS movement. And finally, and perhaps one of the most egregious international legal indictments of all, the contracting parties to the Geneva Convention, the repository of international humanitarian law, met after Durban in 2001 for the first time. In 52 years, the contracting parties to the Geneva Convention had never convened. They convened for the first time in 2001 to put one state in the docket of the accused. It wasn't Russia, it wasn't China, it wasn't Syria, it wasn't Libya. I can go on. One state was put in the docket of the accused, and that was Israel. I might add that since then, the contracting parties to the Geneva Convention have met twice, and each time one state was put in the docket of the accused and condemned, and that state was Israel. And so it was then that in the aftermath of Durban, you began to see as well a full-fledged emergence of anti-Semitism as an assault on human rights, while being in fact weaponized under the rubric of human rights. For example, you had the birth of what I would call genocidal anti-Semitism. By genocidal anti-Semitism, I'm speaking of the toxic convergence of the advocacy of the most horrific of crimes, namely genocide, embedded in the most vile of hatreds, namely anti-Semitism, and publicly calling for the destruction of Israel and the killing of Jews wherever they may be. That genocidal anti-Semitism made its first, if you will, institutional expression in the run-up to Durban, where one of the 4 regional conferences on the road to Durban was held in Iran, and where the phenomenon of genocidal anti-Semitism began to receive its first tailwind. And then it has been forgotten, if it was ever known, that the 21st century began on January 3rd with the supreme leader of Iran, Ayatollah Khamenei, saying that there can be no resolution to the Arab-Israeli conflict without the annihilation of the Jewish state. Did not even use the euphemism of the Zionist regime. And that, of course, has continued and metastasized since, with states of the international community ignoring that preventing and combating genocidal anti-Semitism, incitement to genocide, is not a policy option. It is an international legal obligation under the Genocide Convention. And this was so held, in fact, in a Supreme Court of Canada case, the Mugesera case, which held that the very incitement to genocide constitutes a violation of the Genocide Convention, whether or not acts of genocide follow. Yet, this kind of genocidal incitement has been allowed to continue with impunity, which only continues to incentivize its occurrence. And you saw these other manifestations of anti-Semitism as an assault on human rights. I'm referring here to demonological anti-Semitism. For example, and this too, Durban became the impetus for it, the notion and condemnation of Israel as a racist, imperialist, ethnic cleansing, child murdering, apartheid, Nazi state. And this too has become part, regrettably, of the human rights lexicon in the campus culture in particular, where the campus culture emerged with the human rights revolution as being a human rights culture, something that I celebrated in the 70s, then as a law professor, that the campus culture was becoming a human rights culture. And at the same time, Palestinianism became the poster child for human rights. I didn't regret that as well because I was a strong, long-time supporter of two states for two peoples. But that notion of two states for two peoples, because two states for me is too idle and lazy a formula. Two states for two peoples presupposes the mutual acknowledgement of each other's legitimacy. And this was being, in fact, overtaken by the kind of demonological anti-Semitism that I described. A third form of anti-Semitism was that of political anti-Semitism, also emerging in the wake of Durban, though not originating in Durban. By political anti-Semitism, I'm referring not only to the denial of Israel's existence, but to its denial of its very legitimacy, not only the denial of the Jewish people's right to self-determination, but to the denial even of the existence of a Jewish people, four manifestations of political anti-Semitism. And you had, of course, the dynamic developments, not only of Holocaust denial and distortion, you had as well then and continuing and metastasizing since terrorist anti-Semitism, again being carried out under the cover of human rights. So I can go on and elaborate, but I think you're seeing the outcome of the second tipping point, what happened at Durban, which again here too has been proceeding inexorably, indulgently, and at times even unacknowledged ever since. And this brings me now to the third tipping point. The third tipping point was the Gaza war, Hamas war against Israel in May 2021. I happened to have been in Israel at the time and was there when over 4,000 rockets were launched indiscriminately to target Israeli civilians, but the condemnations became with respect to Israel's response, not to the rockets, indiscriminate rockets, where each firing of a rocket indiscriminately has been held to be, under international law, to be a war crime. But here too, this was turned on its head. And let me just discuss in terms of intersectionality, and use it in this sense, the interaction between what happened in the Gaza war and what happened globally, and using Canada as an example, where Jews were targeted and threatened in their neighborhoods and in the streets, on the campuses and in the communities, where Holocaust memorials were defaced, synagogues were torched, cemeteries were desecrated, Jewish institutions were vandalized, leading to the highest incidence at that time of hate crimes targeting Jews, and to an explosive incidence of hate on the internet. For example, in May 2021, in 1 week, you had 17,000 tweets to the effect that Hitler was right. So here you had a tipping point with respect to the Gaza war against, the Hamas war against Israel. In the wake of that, the Canadian government and myself acting as special envoy, we convened the first ever national summit to combat anti-Semitism in the presence of the Prime Minister, some 10 government ministers who had respective responsibilities for different ministries involved in the combating of anti-Semitism, whether it be justice or public safety or foreign policy and the like, with parliamentary representation from all parties, and with a diverse representation from members of the Jewish community. And there were two lived experiences that were shared, which the Prime Minister of Canada, Justin Trudeau, who having opened the conference, in closing the conference, shared what really in particular impacted on him. And there were these two testimonies that I would share with you. One was a student at the University of Toronto who described himself as being a progressive student, as a left-wing student, if you will, but who found himself, as he said, being marginalized in the campus culture, his speech being silenced, and having to, as he put it, being forced to choose between his Jewish identity and acceptance in the campus culture, where he was being, for example, stereotyped as being part of the white privileged, if not supremacist class, and acting as an apologist for the white supremacist Israel in the Middle East. And as I said, and as he shared, being forced to choose between his Jewish identity and acceptance in the progressive campus culture. The second testimony that made an impact was that of a Black Jewish woman who, as she put it, embodied intersectionality, but said that she was being discriminated against not only because she was a woman, not only because she was Black, but also because she was Jewish, and at times that particular part of her identity was being targeted the most. And so it was in the immediate aftermath of that conference where I was asked as well to share the constituent elements of a national action plan to combat anti-Semitism, that the Canadian government at the Malmo October conference in Malmo, Sweden, conference on Holocaust, Remembrance, and combating anti-Semitism, made a series of country pledges, as all other countries were asked to do, and where in those country pledges, some of the bases for a national action plan to combat anti-Semitism, which could be those of other countries, were shared. This included the importance, as the Prime Minister put it on behalf of Canada, of education, Holocaust education, and education regarding anti-Semitism across generational lines. In other words, the Holocaust is a paradigm for radical evil, and anti-Semitism as a paradigm for radical hate. The support for the IRA, or Intergovernmental Organization, International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, and the enhancement of both the adoption and implementation of the IRA working definition on anti-Semitism. The combating not only of Holocaust denial, but increasingly of Holocaust distortion. The establishment of the Office of the Special Envoy, at that time I was the only person occupying the office, not only as a permanent office, but one that would be funded with a staff and the like. These were just some of the recommendations that emerged from the National Summit and that found expression in the Malmo Conference on Anti-Semitism, and most recently were read into the Canadian budget. Which brings me now to the last point, and that is returning to where I began, the paradox, this global escalation of anti-Semitism, and yet the forces involved in combating anti-Semitism. As you see, using Canada as a case study, the holding of a national summit, the establishment of a national action plan to combat anti-Semitism. And so one has to ask oneself, how does one explain this paradox? And let me now just, as I reported in Canada in the end of my first year as special envoy, just summarize the dynamics which I think have particular relevance for the university culture. The first is that we have to, I think, refine our approach to the combating of anti-Semitism. We have been speaking of it in terms of the kind of tripartite paradigm of combating anti-Semitism from the far right, anti-Semitism from the far left, and radical Islam. While those constituent elements of anti-Semitism remain to be combated, it's, in my view, a paradigm which is insufficient. What we've been witnessing, and I believe this is particularly reflective in the university culture, what we've been witnessing is a mainstreaming, a normalizing a legitimation of anti-Semitism, particularly, as I said, in the campus culture, accompanied by an absence of outrage, underpinned even by indifference and inaction. And that is why I commend the work of the Academic Engagement Network, because you've shattered that silence, you've combated that indifference, you've confronted that inaction, and done so in the name of protecting academic freedom, protecting academic integrity, and the like. So that's the first dynamic. The second dynamic that we have to appreciate is what I would call the globalization of anti-Semitism. I mentioned this in the annual reports that have emerged recently, but there's another dimension to that globalization, and that's the manner in which it replicates itself in different parts of the world. For example, in the May 2021 Hamas war against Israel, you had convoys going through the streets of London saying, F the Jews will rape your daughters. You then had similar convoys going through streets in Canada saying the same thing. And so there was this orchestrated globalization of anti-Semitism being replicated in different parts. The third thing, and I've witnessed this in Canada, and I have seen empirical data from the States suggesting the same, and that is the marginalization of anti-Semitism in the combating of racism. In other words, if you look at diversity, equity, inclusion, and the reports of these groups, you find that anti-Semitism is being marginalized in their work. In fact, anti-Semitism has somehow found expression even in their work. And in Canada, where I, as special envoy, undertook studies of this, I found both within and without government the marginalizing of anti-Semitism in the overall combating of racism. And as we are witnessing what I would call a pandemic of systemic racism, we need to combat all forms of racism. As I've said, in Canada, in particular, we need to combat systemic racism against Indigenous people, against Blacks and people of color, against Asian Canadians, against Muslims, but we cannot ignore or marginalize the combating of anti-Semitism in that effort. But this leads to a fourth dynamic, and this is the actual laundering of anti-Semitism under the very cover of anti-racism itself. And I've described some manifestations of that, as in the testimony of the Jewish student being forced to choose between his Jewish identity and acceptance into the progressive campus culture, and the phenomenons of intersectionality in that regard as well. This leads as well to an appreciation of the tipping points that I mentioned, of the three tipping points which have to be factored into our understanding of anti-Semitism as it is laundered, in a word, under the protective cover of the UN, under the authority of international law, under the culture of human rights, as well as I mentioned, under the struggle against racism. And what we have been finding has been what I would call a perfect international storm of the last 2 years, which has included what I would call the fourth tipping point in the combating of anti-Semitism. By the perfect international storm, this is an informed group, so I'll do it in a series of one-liners. The weaponization of COVID-19 pandemic in order to accuse Israel, Jews, the Jewish people of manufacturing the COVID virus, of causing its spread, of profiting from it, the classic trope. I don't need to go into that, as well as how some anti-vaxxers have appropriated Holocaust symbols and the like. So the weaponization of the COVID pandemic. Second, the weaponization of social media. And this here too has had a dramatic impact, and the evidence bears it out, where in different platforms, you've had dramatic increases with respect to anti-Semitism. The third is, as I've mentioned, and in a very broad scale form and with particular expression in the campuses, and that is the weaponization of human rights and the laundering of anti-Semitism under its cover. The fourth is the pandemic of systemic racism, which is broken out, as I said, and I used Canada as an example, but the increasing marginalization of anti-Semitism in that phenomenon, and weaponization here too against the Jewish people. The next is the global political pandemic with its anti-Semitic fallout. I'm referring here to the combination of the resurgent global authoritarianism, the backsliding of democracies, the liberal populism, assaults on human rights, and leading to another dimension of it, a culture of impunity in all these matters, which only incentivizes both systemic racism generally and anti-Semitism as well. And this leads to what has been happening with regard to Russia and the Ukraine. And here too, the misappropriation of symbolism and laundering, where, for example, the Palestinians are held out to be the Ukrainians, Israel is held out to be the Russians, and you've got, yet again, attributions through these tropes of Israeli war crimes and crimes against humanity, as if it were the same as what Russia is doing to the Ukrainians. And finally, and this I sense as a part of the fourth tipping point, and I've been recently in Israel, as I mentioned, and that is the developing religious incitement, the intensification of the label or libel that Israel, the Jews, are storming the Al-Aqsa Mosque, which in fact gets incentivized more with its propagation on the social media. And I can tell you, while being in Israel and experiencing the spate of terrorist attacks that were taking place in Beersheba and Hadera and Tel Aviv and in Bnei Brak, what one found is that while in Israel, these terrorist attacks were being experienced on a regular basis, and many, many others that were thwarted, in the States and in Canada and elsewhere, either these terrorist attacks went unreported or only the Israeli response was selectively reported, and the libel of the storming of the Al-Aqsa Mosque became a new metaphor for religious incitement against Israel and the Jews. And I'm worried that this could metastasize as yet another tipping point or another prelude if Hamas wishes to instrumentalize it for yet another war. Because in the same way that the May 2021 war occurred with Hamas holding itself out as the guardians of Jerusalem, as the protector of the Muslims, as the protectors of Arab interests in the West Bank as well as in Israel and elsewhere. So you have now a similar phenomenon where Hamas competes with the Palestinian Authority for who represents the Palestinian people, Israeli Arabs, Muslims best, and compete with each other for the condemnation of Israel and the Jews with regard to the Al-Aqsa label, to use just one example. So let me just close with all of this to say that the AEN, Academic Engagement Network, has, in my view, a particular role, and I think you've described it in terms of engagement, education, and empowerment. And let me just suggest some things of particular relevance to the combating of anti-Semitism in general and the campus culture in particular. With this, I close with a number of one-liners. The first thing is, I think it's important to make the case, because if we make the case only that anti-Semitism is prejudicial to Jews or prejudicial to Israel, people will say it should be prejudicial to Israel. Israel is such a major human rights violator that it's not anti-Semitism at all. It's holding Israel to account as it should be held to account, ignoring, as I said, the selective singling out. But what concerns me is that we are ignoring what Dr. Ahmed Shahid, the UN Special Rapporteur on Freedom of Religion and Belief, said in his landmark report in October 2019 to the UN, when he said that anti-Semitism is toxic to democracies. In other words, anti-Semitism is, at this point, the canary in the mineshaft of global evil. And as we've learned only too well and too painfully, that while it begins with Jews, it doesn't end with Jews. And I think we have to make the case of anti-Semitism as being toxic to the human condition, toxic to democracies, as being the ultimate assault on human rights, as it weaponizes human rights for purposes of carrying out that assault. And that gives it its Orwellian dimension. A second thing is, we need to engage more, not simply in Holocaust education, because the Holocaust is a paradigm for radical evil, but anti-Semitism is a paradigm for radical hate. We need more education about the nature, the manifestations, and the impact of anti-Semitism, some of which I sought to share with you, and how it is being laundered under, as I said, the protective cover of the UN, under the authority of international law, under the culture of human rights, under the struggle against. In other words, if we care about each of these features and facets of what democracy and human rights and the human condition is all about, then we have to see to it that there isn't this selective weaponizing of each of these dynamics for the purposes of instrumentalizing anti-Semitism. We need to combat the increasing manifestations of Holocaust distortion as well as Holocaust denial. We need to engage more our parliaments in the respective countries. I know that you've got a bipartisan task force in the US, we have in Canada, but sometimes some of the principles and precedents of a parliamentary nature are not all that well known. For example, in 2010, we held an interparliamentary conference about anti-Semitism in Ottawa, which followed one of a similar character in London in 2009. They adopted what eventually became the IRA working definition on anti-Semitism, word for word, when it was finally unanimously adopted in 2016. In other words, the IRA working definition on anti-Semitism, its origins and its nature and its purpose is itself not well known, and education is needed in that regard. This is not only the most authoritative, comprehensive, and international consensus definition we have, but it is the most representative, one that was democratically adopted over a 15-year decision-making process. And as someone who participated in it, in its drafting as well, going back to the initial beginning of that drafting in the wake of the Durban conference in Stockholm in 2001, when the late Elie Wiesel and former Deputy Prime Minister Per Ahlmark and myself were charged with drafting what became the working definition of anti-Semitism. I have to tell you that it was anchored in human rights, anchored in equality law, using examples from the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, using our international treaty obligations of our requirement to prohibit incitement to discrimination, hostility, and violence as set forth in the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. It was intended to protect speech, not to silence speech, to protect the speech of university students, particularly university students whose speech was being silenced or who were being maligned. At the same time, as it clearly said, that criticizing Israel like any other state is not anti-Semitic, and you can certainly support Palestinian human rights, an independent Palestinian state, etc. None of that is prohibited and is sometimes suggested under the IRA working definition. And finally, to close, we need to develop national action plans to combat anti-Semitism as part of global action plans for that purpose. We are working the special envoys now in that regard. We hope to produce a global action plan to combat anti-Semitism under the auspices of the United Nations that will join with national action plans, have the coalition of special envoys working in concert and making it clear that anti-Semitism constitutes an assault on human rights, toxic to our democracies, undermines the human condition. And as I said, and as we've learned historically only too painfully and too well, that while it begins with Jews, it doesn't end with Jews. And so the principle allyship, we need to work together to combat all forms of hate. And when we combat all forms of hate, we also cannot ignore the paradigmatic form of hate, which is anti-Semitism. Thank you.
Irwin, for sharing your remarks, your thoughts, your impressions of the challenges, what we need to do about them, what you are doing about them. And this talk that you delivered to us, taking us back to the 1970s and through to Durban, your own experiences there, what you witnessed and saw, and then on to today, the challenges on campus globally, and what we can do to combat this scourge that harms all of us and our democracies. And thank you for everything that you're doing in Canada and globally. I just want to, again, a round of applause for you and your work. And we do have some time for a few questions. And I know there are those in the room that would like to talk, and I think online as well. I'll have my colleague share some of those. We'll pass the mic around. Ellen, please go ahead.
Thank you once again for your just penetrating information and imperative for us to work together with you on this battle. One of the things that I would like to ask you to comment on is our faculty in the United States is also experiencing, in an effort to organize faculty and teaching assistants, the growth of labor organizing in faculty and in teaching assistants. But our largest educational labor unions that are doing this have taken a firm stance in pro-Palestinian in the binary language that you have discussed. And what we're watching is the further institutionalization of another aspect of faculty that is an effort to protect faculty rights, is also part of an effort to spread the cancer that you have so aptly described. Is there something that we can do to penetrate the emerging role of the labor organizing, which is very positive in so many ways to protect faculty and freedom, but is also an additional institution in promoting the laundering of anti-Semitism?
You know, you described as well yet another phenomenon. I mean, Jews were at one point very engaged in the labor movement itself, and the labor movement was one of the sources historically, of support, let's say, for Israel and the Jewish people. This is another manifestation of a historical dynamic where those who were in support have now, and we see this, I should tell you, in Canada as well. The labor movement in Canada has rejected, for example, the IRA working definition on anti-Semitism without fully understanding it, appreciating it, etc. But there just was developed a mantra that the IRA working definition on anti-Semitism silences speech, silences pro-Palestinian advocacy as well. So I think there's an educational effort that is needed here. And let me just try to suggest one approach. I'm not sure how effectively this can be made to work, but I think AEN is in a position to help to make this work. I've adopted a position that when I'm invited by a Jewish student group or Jewish faculty group to speak at a campus, I tell them I won't come unless it is co-organized by other campus groups, organized, as I say, under the principle of allyship with the Black students, Indigenous students, women students, etc. In other words, taking intersectionality and turning it around rather than having it leveraged against us. And I think that we need to return to the model, if I may, of the struggle for Soviet Jewry. When you will recall that at that time we had students for Soviet Jewry, academics for Soviet Jewry, parliamentarians for Soviet Jewry, women for Soviet Jewry, the 35s, scientists for Soviet Jewry, artists for Soviet Jewry. In other words, a critical mass of advocacy. And we, in effect, if you think about it, we patented what is today called intersectionality, except the intersectionality of today is weaponized against us, whereas we patented it at the time so that it was an inclusive movement. And it was a movement where, for example, if you looked at Canada, the largest parliamentary group of any kind was the Canadian parliamentarians for Soviet Jewry. The largest women's group was the 35s with regard to 35s for Soviet Jewry. So I think we have to try to return to that. It's much more difficult, but I think we've got to turn things around by reversing intersectionality, and the academic engagement network, given both your broad experience and reach, can have that impact, I would hope, with the trade movement as well. But it is becoming more difficult. I mean, I don't have to tell you in terms of the American political culture, the divisions amongst the Democratic Party, the polarization is between Republicans and Democrats, and how all these things feed into the role of the labor movement at this point. So I understand the challenges, and I don't want to minimize them, but I think we have to try to see how we can make intersectionality work in the way we originally patented it with the struggle for Soviet Jewry.
Thank you so much.
Hello, my name is Barry Klein. I'm from the University of California, Davis, and thank you so much for your wonderful, inspiring talk, Mr. Cotler. I have a comment and a question. The comment first is, and probably in the context of your talk, you may have said this already, but by these organizations focusing on alleged human rights that take place in Israel and ignoring all the other egregious human rights violations in the world, it really covers up all the other, it really prevents them from doing the job to protect the rest of the world from the huge amounts of human rights violations that exist in other countries. So the cover of anti-Semitism also really doesn't serve the world very well in terms of human rights violations that are taking many lives and hurting many people. The question is the following. It would help us who are in the trenches fighting anti-Semitism on the campuses to hear from you, how do people respond in in the UN human rights commissions and the like, when they're confronted with the fact that Israel is being discriminated against unjustly and everything else is being ignored? What's the rationale they use to justify their behavior so we can prepare ourselves better to fight those false arguments?
Okay, on the first point, your comment is correct. I always tell my colleagues involved in human rights, those who obsess with Israel, I say, look, Israel, like any other state, is responsible for any violations of human rights and humanitarian law. And the Jewish people are not entitled to any particular privilege or preference because of the Holocaust or the horrors of Jewish history. But the problem is not that Israel should seek, or that anyone would seek on its behalf that it be above the law. The problem is that it is being systematically denied equality before the law. Not that Israel should respect human rights, which she must, but that the rights of Israel deserve equal respect. Not that human rights standards should not be applied to Israel. They must be, but these standards must be applied equally to everyone else. And when you're not applying them equally to everyone else, and you're obsessing only with Israel, it isn't only singling out one member state for selective opprobrium and indictment, which would be bad enough. It's exactly what you said. It is the ignoring and sanitizing of the other human rights violations because of this particular obsession. So I think the principle of I just mentioned of equality before the applies also with respect to the UN. Sometimes they may say, well, there should be more condemnations of Israel because of the fact that it is such a major human rights violation. The point is that this is a standing violation of the UN principle of equality for all states, large and small. When you have before, as you know, the UN Human Rights Council, an agenda item 7 that singles out one state, one agenda item that is called Israeli human rights violations in the occupied Palestinian territories, and another agenda item of human rights violations in the rest of the world. Well, this is on its face a singling out of even a kind of Alice in Wonderland situation where the trial and sentencing are adopted even before the investigation begins. So I think our approach has to be that this is not just a matter of being prejudicial to Israel. This is, in effect, undermining the integrity of the United Nations itself. This is, in effect, eroding the authority of international law. This is corrupting the culture of human rights. This is undermining the very struggle against racism itself. And the very indictment of Israel as an apartheid state is demeaning to the real struggle against the real apartheid. And anybody who witnessed and experienced that real struggle and knows also what is happening within Israel, it's utterly absurd. I was just, now when I was in Israel, I happened to, just contracted a couple of health issues. And the people who treated me, the doctor who treated me was Arabic. The nurses were Arabic and Muslim. I mean, I don't have to tell you, many of you have been visiting Israel. The notion of Israeli apartheid is such a false and dishonest libel and label that it is undermining the struggle for human rights as a whole, as well as being utterly demeaning to the real struggle against the real apartheid. So I think what we have to say, if you care about the UN, if you care about international law, if you care about the culture of human rights, if you care about the integrity of the struggle against racism, then you have to cease and desist from the singling out of one member state for selective opprobrium and indictment, and ensure that the principle of equal protection and equal treatment before the law is applied in the international arena as elsewhere. And we're sadly not seeing that. And we're seeing, as I said, the weaponization of human rights, the UN, international law, et cetera, to single out one member state. That's corruptive of all the things we should care for and care about.
Irwin, we've done this conference as a hybrid model, and we have a number of members and and supporters, partners who have joined this session on Zoom. So we are going to see if we can unmute one of our participants who are joining online so that they can ask you a question. So I'm going to let my colleague do that.
So I see this first question here from Judith. Judith, do you mind if we unmute you and you can ask your question?
Oh, thank you so much for unmuting me. I didn't I'm listening in my car on my iPhone. My question has to do with academic organizations for, different professional specialties. I'm a classicist, and my North American organization is both Canadians and United States citizens. And we're, as everyone who knows me knows, we're in a very sad situation where this organization is not only tolerating, but honoring several members, white and Black, who engage openly in anti-Semitic attacks on members such as myself and a Black Jewish classicist on social media. No one's willing to do anything about it. I'm speaking to the ADL this week because I don't want to do something confrontational. I would like to see the diversity and inclusion statements make it explicit that anti-Semitism is not acceptable. And I'm interested in getting some Canadian participation here. You're the first Canadian I've heard on this particular front. I agree with everything you've said. So whatever, we don't have to answer now, but you need to be aware that we really need your support and your wisdom in all of this.
Well, I'm delighted to be able to be helpful wherever I can. Way back when, in fact, in the early 70s, I then with some of my colleagues, we founded the Canadian Professors for Peace in the Middle East. And that was organized around a number of fundamental principles, which not only included, respect for the legitimacy of Israel, but also it supported two states for two peoples, etc. I regret that for a variety of reasons that I won't go into that has lapsed. And I think what you're saying is that we need to engage and
exactly
join forces here. In fact, most people don't even know in Canada of a resolution that was passed in the Canadian Parliament in February 2015. I was then a member of Parliament, having to introduce that resolution, which had three parts very quickly, but it's something that as principle and precedent can be used because it began by saying, alarmed at the growing escalation in anti-Semitism. Part two said, called upon the Canadian government to make the combating of anti-Semitism a priority in both our domestic and foreign policy. Number three said, criticizing Israel is not anti-Semitic, and saying so is wrong. But singling Israel out for selective opprobrium and indictment, denying Israel's right to exist, let alone calling for its destruction, is hateful and discriminatory and anti-Semitic, and not saying so is dishonest. That was unanimously adopted by the Canadian Parliament with participation from all the parties at the time. I can tell you that today that resolution wouldn't even be proposed, let alone be adopted. So it tells us about the change. At the same time, it is there as principle and precedent to be acted upon. And I think this is where we have to come together. Too much of work is being done in silos. And I think the Canadian-American partnership could be a very important one.
Thank you so much. We have time for one last question. Nancy, please go ahead.
Okay. Hi, thank you so much. I've heard you speak in Seattle a couple of times, and it's great to hear you once again. I teach at the Evergreen State College in Olympia, Washington, just south of Seattle. I just want to return to the question of apartheid, and I'm thinking about what I face as a teacher teaching about Israel. There's a big difference between civic life in Israel proper, where a quarter of the population are Israeli Palestinians on the one hand, and the situation for Palestinians in the West Bank, Gaza, and East Jerusalem when it comes to human rights. This is something that I have found in my teaching that students don't know at all. They have no idea that the Arab population of Israeli citizens are Palestinians. They don't know that. They're shocked to learn that. And they don't know why there are Palestinians who are doctors in Israel. So that's a big learning curve for a lot of students. But it does leave open the question then about the human rights of Palestinians in the West Bank, Gaza, and East Jerusalem. Who is responsible for the lack of rights that they suffer from, is what students want to know. And is the cost of Jewish sovereignty and power in the international community of nations the human rights of others? This is what students want to know. Thank you.
Thank you. No, it's a very important question, and it's probably difficult or superficial to do it in one-liners. I think that we have to reverse a certain paradigm of misunderstanding. The paradigm of misunderstanding is one that goes as follows, that the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is a source of all conflict in the Middle East and beyond, that the occupation is a source of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and apartheid Israel is the source of the occupation. I think we need to turn it around and make it clear that regrettably, because unless we want to remove agency from the Palestinians or the Arab leadership and engage in the bigotry, not only of soft expectations, but low expectations or no expectations, we have to say that, you know, both parties have responsibilities here. Israel has responsibilities with respect to the protection of human rights. There are different legal regimes in Israel and in the West Bank, and because of the Six-Day War, the et cetera, which introduced different legal frameworks with different responsibilities. And the Palestinians, under the Oslo agreements, which are still in existence, basically have effective authority and control in what's called areas A and B, whereas Israel has control over area C. I don't want to go, you know, into the details here. I think the important thing is, problem number one is that much of the Israeli-Palestinian Arab conflict is ahistorical. People know what is happening now or in the last decade. They know very little about the origins and nature of the conflict. They know very little about the fact that in 75 years ago, you had a UN proposed General Assembly resolution recommending the partition of then Palestine into a Jewish state and an Arab state, that the Jewish leadership at the time accepted that recommendation, that the Arab and Palestinian leadership did not. Mind you, they had a right not to accept the recommendation if they felt it was contrary to their interests. What they didn't have a right to do was to then launch a war of aggression, which they spoke of, not we, which they spoke of as a war of extermination against Israeli Jews at the time. And what they didn't have a right to do was to then turn on their own Jewish nationals living in Arab countries, basically dispossessing them of their rights, basically engaged in exiling and expelling them. So as a result of these two acts of aggression, you ended up with two sets of refugees. You had Palestinian Arab refugees from the Arab-Palestinian assault on Israel, and you had Jewish refugees from Arab lands resulting from the dispossession then by the Arab leadership. And it's a tragedy to think that if that partition resolution had been accepted 75 years ago, we would today be celebrating the 75th anniversary of two states for two peoples and avoided all the immense human suffering on both sides. But it's difficult to get into these historical appreciations because people are not prepared now to go back in time. And so you have to, although I think it's important to frame an historical understanding, but even in terms of contemporary terms, I think the position has to be that what is needed at this point is mutual acknowledgement and respect of each other's rights and legitimacy. And if we indulge a culture of rejectionism by any of the Palestinian or Arab leadership, we are indulging the bigotry of no expectations, of ignoring their agency. And as I've always said, I strongly support Palestinian people's right to self-determination and their right to an independent state. But as I've always said, the right to a democratic state. The Palestinians do not need to be the targets of yet another authoritarian leadership. And what is needed at this point is a independent Palestinian rule of law, rights protecting Palestinian state alongside a democratic rights protecting Israeli state. If we pursue and protect those two principles and policies for the mutual acknowledgement of each other's legitimacy of peoples and states, that would be the best formulation. And eschew any notion of rejectionism or any notion, as I said, of a bigotry of no expectations and not having any agency for the Palestinians. I met last July with the foreign minister of the Palestinian Authority, Riyad Malki. I had known him for a long time. And when I went to meet with him, I mentioned to him exactly what I'm saying to you. And I said, look, I said, I have certain criticisms of Israeli policy and practice, and I mentioned it to them. And now I'm meeting with you, and I have certain critiques, which include also from my responsibilities as special envoy for combating anti-Semitism. And I mentioned it to him. I mentioned that the pay for slay incentivizes terrorism, and that does not befit a state that seeks to be protecting all its citizens and living in peace with Israel. And he said to me, we're going to work on that. We're working on it now with the US, and we will find a way to do away with it. But it hasn't happened. I mentioned also about the importance of education for peace, and certainly not education for incitement. I talked about the school books used by UNRWA. And again, his response was, we're working with the European Union. We are going to correct those school books, but that too has not happened. And then I mentioned about anti-Semitism in the Palestinian social media. And he mentioned to me, well, you know, you 11 years ago had suggested a joint US, Israel, Palestinian committee on incitement. We set that up, and then Israel withdrew from it. I'm prepared to set that up again. I then reported on this meeting back to the Israeli authorities. And the one thing that did come out of that initial meeting was I said, look, 2 states for 2 peoples seems to be in the distance, but relations between peoples on matters of common concern should be established. And so one of the recommendations that I did make at the time then did come to pass, and that was because matters of health transcend boundaries, and we had the pandemic, then that the health ministers should at least meet, and they did. That matters of environment transcend boundaries, that the environmental ministers should meet, and they did. And I also recommended that meetings take place at the foreign ministry level and the like. In other words, we need to encourage as much as we can relationships between peoples on matters of common concern until such time as we can get relationships between states based on, as I said, 2 states for 2 peoples acknowledging each other's legitimacy and independence. That may be a thing in the future, but we have to try to foster human relationships that may lead to that, and environment and health were places to begin.
Thank you
Thank
so
you.
much, Irwin, for those important words and really concrete recommendations for us to take back to our classrooms, our courses, our professional associations, our disciplines. And thank you so much for being with us today, for sharing your important work. I know I saw people taking a lot of notes. You brought a lot for us to think about. We look forward to continuing to engage with you on the potential expansion of AN to Canada. So thank you so much, and pleasure to have been with you today. Please join me in thanking Irwin Cotler.
Thanks, and continue the great work, and I hope to be able to participate in it with you.